Welcome to my channel, Crimson Inquiry.
In the heart of a frozen London morning, something impossible was found. Sherlock Holmes sees what others overlook. To uncover truth, he must follow the trail into the storm, where silence echoes louder than screams. Entombed in ice lies a secret no one was meant to find. An experiment born from genius and madness. Every truth has a price, and every mind a limit. When the ice breaks, the truth will awaken. Between life and death, she opens her eyes. The case of the frozen footprints, solved but not forgotten.
It was on one of those bitterly cold mornings of late January that I found myself once more in the familiar warmth of our quarters at Baker Street, watching my friend Sherlock Holmes as he bent over the hearth, examining with great interest a small, oddly shaped fragment of ice that glimmered faintly in the firelight. You observe, "Watson," said he without lifting his gaze, "that even the most ephemeral of substances, ice, in this case, may preserve a record far more enduring than parchment or stone." Before I could inquire further, Mrs. Hudson entered with a card upon a salver. Holmes took it with his usual brisk glance. "Inspector Lestrade," he remarked, "and at an hour that suggests either great urgency or great folly. Pray, Watson, let us hope it is the former." Moments later, our door burst open to admit the short, wiry figure of the Scotland Yard inspector. His moustache rhymed with frost and his breath rising visibly in the cold air. "Holmes, I'll be damned if I've ever seen the like," Lestrade declared, unfastening his coat with trembling fingers. "A crime scene frozen solid, and I mean that literally. The only clue we have are footprints, frozen into the ice as though carved by a sculptor. No other marks, no blood, no struggle, nothing." Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his long fingers. "Frozen footprints, you say? How intriguing. And the location?" "Frost Lane, out by Hampstead Heath. A reclusive gentleman named Mr. Edwin March was found dead in his study this morning, locked from within, the windows sealed with frost. Outside, on the path leading to his door, a single trail of footprints, perfectly preserved, as if time itself had stopped." Holmes's eyes gleamed with that peculiar light which only the promise of a true puzzle could ignite. "And whose footprints are they presumed to be?" "That's just it," Lestrade replied. "They lead to the door, but none lead away. No one else was seen, and yet the man is dead." Holmes rose at once, his face animated with a mixture of delight and concentration. "A case in which the elements themselves conspire to conceal or reveal the truth. Fascinating. Fetch your coat, Watson. I believe we shall find more in that ice than Scotland Yard could read in an open confession." The carriage rattled through the narrow streets of London, the hooves of the horses striking sharp echoes against the frozen cobblestones. The air was heavy with frost, and the fog clung low to the ground, curling like spectral tendrils around the lamps. Holmes sat opposite me, his sharp profile illuminated intermittently by the flickering glow from passing streetlights. He had drawn his coat tightly about him, but his eyes burned with an intensity that defied the winter chill. "Watson," he began suddenly, "have you ever noticed how nature often conspires to conceal human folly? Snow, fog, and ice, all beautiful disguises for crime. Yet," he added with a faint smile, "they are equally the instruments of truth to those who know how to read them." "You mean the footprints, I take it?" I said. Lestrade's description seemed almost supernatural. "Supernatural phenomena, my dear Watson, are merely the limits of human explanation," he replied dryly. "I have no doubt we shall find a rational pattern beneath the frost. As we left the clatter of the city behind, the road grew quieter and the houses fewer. Frost Lane lived up to its name. The hedgerows sparkled with ice, and the trees stood stiff and pale as though sculpted in glass. By the time our carriage drew up before the March residence, a pale sun was struggling to rise through the veil of mist, casting a ghostly shimmer over the landscape. Inspector Lestrade was waiting for us, stamping his feet beside two constables who looked half frozen. The house itself was a gloomy structure, built of dark stone, its windows glistening with frost, as though the entire dwelling were encased in crystal. Holmes dismounted and immediately bent low to examine the path. The constables moved aside as he crouched, peering intently at the stretch of frozen ground that led from the small garden gate to the front steps. "Pray do not disturb the surface," he warned sharply. "Even a careless breath may mar what time has preserved for us." I followed his gaze and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. There, set in the translucent ice, was a perfect sequence of footprints, crisp, sharp, and astonishingly deep. They were unmistakably human, yet something about their spacing seemed unusual. The stride was long, the impressions narrow, and they ended directly before the front door. "No return prints," Holmes murmured. "None," said Lestrade, "and the door was locked from the inside. We had to break it open. The servants swear their master was alone last night. No one entered after dusk." Holmes produced his magnifying lens and examined the ice closely, muttering to himself. Then, to my astonishment, he removed one of his gloves and pressed his bare fingers lightly against the frozen surface. "Holmes," I exclaimed. "You'll freeze your hand." "Not before I learn what the frost wishes to tell me," he replied absently. "Ah, there it is. You see, Watson, the ridges here are faintly fractured along the edges." The pressure was applied when the surface was soft, then solidified rapidly. "These prints were made not at dawn, as one might suppose, but during the night, just before the freeze deepened." He stood abruptly and turned to Lestrade. "You mentioned the victim was found in his study." "Aye, right through here," said the inspector, leading us toward the door. Inside, the air was stifling, the warmth of the fireplace having long since died. Frost clung to the corners of the window panes like white lace. The room was neat, almost unnervingly so. Mr. Edwin March, a gentleman of scholarly appearance, lay slumped over his writing desk, his face pale and expressionless. There were no signs of struggle, no broken furniture, no disturbed papers. "The doctor believes it was heart failure," said Lestrade. "But the odd thing is, the window was open a crack when we arrived, yet there's frost inside the sill, as though someone had shut it during the freeze." Holmes examined the window silently, then turned to the hearth. A few half-burned papers rested in the grate, their edges curled. He plucked one free with the poker and studied it carefully. Only a fragment of writing remained visible. The debt must be settled before the 13th, or the rest was lost to the flames. "A financial matter," Holmes murmured. "Always a likely companion to murder. But I am not yet convinced that we are dealing with murder at all." Lestrade frowned. "You mean to say the man might have died naturally after all that?" Holmes smiled faintly. "I mean to say that appearances are nature's most artful disguise. Consider. A man found dead in a locked room, a trail of footprints that begins but does not end, frost within and without. We must ask not how these things occurred, but why they were meant to appear so." He moved about the room with his peculiar feline grace, inspecting corners, bookshelves, and even the small brass key that still protruded from the study door's inner lock. Finally, he paused before a large glass decanter upon the desk. It contained a dark liquid that shimmered oddly in the dim light. He sniffed it once, then handed it to me. "Smell, but do not taste." I obeyed and wrinkled my nose. "Brandy, perhaps? But there's an acrid odor beneath it, something chemical." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "Hydrochloric acid, I believe. Used to dissolve metals. And Mr. March was an amateur chemist, was he not, Lestrade?" "That's right," said the inspector. "Had a little laboratory out back." Holmes's eyes flickered with interest. "Then it is there we must go next." We stepped out through a side door into the rear garden, where a small stone outbuilding stood half buried in frost. Inside, shelves lined with jars and instruments gave off the faint metallic scent of science. Holmes examined a beaker on the workbench, then the floor, where he stopped abruptly. "Watson," he said quietly, "look here." A second set of footprints, smaller, lighter, crossed the floor near the back door. Unlike the ones outside, these had been pressed into a thin crust of frost that had formed within the room itself. But what caught my attention most was that they overlapped faint smudges of soot, suggesting they had been made after the fire in the small furnace had died. Holmes bent low, measuring the stride. "A woman," he said softly. 5.5 stone in weight, judging by the depth. The heel pressure suggests haste, yet there is no sign of disarray. Curious, could she have entered after the man's death? I asked. Unlikely. The outer door was bolted. More likely she left before the freeze, perhaps even before the murder, if such it proves to be. But she left no mark outside. How does one depart unseen from a room whose only door and window are sealed by frost? He rose, brushing off his hands. "This, Watson, is not the work of nature's cold alone. Someone has used the frost itself as an accomplice. The footprints may be a trail, or they may be a message." We stood in silence as the morning light crept across the garden, turning the ice into a pale mirror. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful, then resolute. "There is something deliberate here," he said, "a mind that understands both chemistry and deceit. We must learn more of Mr. March's acquaintances, particularly anyone of delicate stature and scientific inclination." Lestrade nodded. "I'll send word to his manservant. Says there was a lady who visited him from time to time, a Mrs. Clara Fenwick, widow of a chemist as it happens." Holmes's lips curved in satisfaction. "Then let us hope, my dear Watson, that Mrs. Fenwick's memory proves less frozen than the path that led us here." And with that, he turned once more toward the silent house, his keen gaze fixed upon the glittering footprints that gleamed like secrets etched in ice. Holmes wasted no time once the lead was presented. Within the hour, we were back in the sitting room of the March residence, a small fire rekindled to drive away the lingering chill. Lestrade busied himself questioning the servants, while Holmes sat perfectly still, his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin, his eyes distant, yet razor-sharp. I had seen that expression before. It was the look of a mind assembling the pieces of an invisible puzzle. After several minutes of silence, he spoke. "Watson, I should like to hear everything the servants can tell us about Mrs. Clara Fenwick." A nervous housemaid, pale from both the cold and the questioning, was ushered in. Her name was Lydia, a timid girl of perhaps 20. She curtsied slightly before speaking, her voice trembling. "Mrs. Fenwick came here often, sir. Every fortnight, sometimes more. Mr. March called her his consulting friend. They spoke much of chemicals and experiments. She was always polite, though quiet, and she never stayed beyond dusk." Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. "And when was her last visit?" "2 nights ago, sir. She came just before supper." They spoke in the study for near an hour. "I remember because the clock struck 8 when she left. I saw her take her carriage from the lane." "Her carriage?" Holmes repeated softly. "Driven by whom?" "By her own coachman, sir. A tall man with a scar on his cheek. I've seen him before. Did you happen to notice the weather at that hour?" "It had begun to snow," she said, frowning as though recalling a dream. "Not heavy, but steady enough. The ground was covered before I went to bed." Holmes nodded once, his lips tightening as if a thought had begun to crystallize. "You have been most helpful, my dear," he said gently. "That will be all." When she had gone, Holmes turned to me. "Do you perceive it, Watson? The footprints outside the study door must have been made after Mrs. Fenwick's departure, since the snow had already begun to fall when she left. Yet those same prints are preserved beneath the topmost layer of ice. Meaning they were made after the snow stopped and before the deeper freeze set in," I said, piecing it together. "Exactly. Which places their creation not at 8, but closer to midnight." His eyes shone with sudden animation. "We must determine who had access to the house during that interval." Lestrade, who had returned from his questioning, interjected, "No one, as far as the servants know. The doors were locked, the master alone in his study, and the only sound they heard was the wind." Holmes stood and began pacing, his long strides carrying him from hearth to window and back again. The locked room, the solitary footprints, the chemical residue. It is all a pattern, Watson. But the shape of that pattern remains obscured by a thin film of deceit. He stopped abruptly at the mantelpiece, his gaze fixed upon a framed photograph that stood there. It was a portrait of a younger Edwin March and a second man, both wearing laboratory aprons. The second figure was tall, broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed beard and the unmistakable scar upon his left cheek. "Lestrade," said Holmes quietly, "did you notice this gentleman's resemblance to Mrs. Fenwick's coachman?" The inspector's eyes widened. "By Jove, it is him! But what would her coachman be doing in a photograph with March?" Holmes's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Not her coachman, Lestrade, her late husband." A stunned silence fell. I could hear the faint hiss of the fire as a drop of melted frost fell into the grate. Holmes continued, his tone steady and deliberate. "To observe the label beneath the photograph, March and Fenwick, 1887. They were partners once. If she retained her husband's manservant, it would not be the first time loyalty outlived its master. The question then is why she returned to the scene of an old association. He turned toward the frosted window. We must pay Mrs. Fenwick a visit. There is something about this case that reeks of unfinished business, and I should dearly like to see the expression upon her face when she learns that the ice did not erase every trace of her past. The journey to Mrs. Fenwick's residence in Kensington took us through streets that gleamed like glass beneath the pale sun. The house, when we reached it, was modest but elegant, a two-story townhouse with ivy frozen against its walls. A maid answered our knock and ushered us into a sitting room where Mrs. Fenwick awaited. She was a woman of striking composure, her dark attire perfectly tailored, her gloved hands resting upon the arm of her chair. Only the faintest tremor at the corner of her mouth betrayed unease when she saw Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," she said in a voice that was calm, almost musical. "Inspector Lestrade, to what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Holmes bowed slightly. "To the memory of an old friend, madam. Edwin March." Her composure faltered just a fraction. "I was informed of his passing only this morning. A tragic loss. He was a brilliant man." "Indeed," said Holmes, studying her keenly. "Brilliance such as his often attracts both admiration and resentment. I understand you were well acquainted with him, and that your late husband was once his partner." A shadow crossed her face. "They worked together years ago. Their collaboration ended, unhappily. I believe Mr. March accused my husband of misusing funds. He was mistaken, of course. The scandal ruined us both." Holmes inclined his head. "And yet you continued to visit him?" "For purely professional reasons. Mr. March had agreed to review one of my husband's old formulas, an effort to clear his name posthumously. I assure you there was no animosity between us." Holmes's eyes flicked to the gloves upon her hands. "And on the night of your last visit?" "I left at 8, she said firmly. The snow had begun to fall. "My coachman can confirm it." "Ah, yes, the same coachman who once served your late husband." She hesitated. "Yes, Mr. Hollis has been in my employ for many years. Then perhaps he might also recall whether you instructed him to return later that night." Her eyes widened, and for an instant the carefully composed mask slipped. "Return? No, certainly not. Why should I?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Because, Mrs. Fenwick, the trail outside Mr. March's house ends at his door, yet no living man could have entered without leaving a second trail behind. Unless, of course, he used means available only to one familiar with the chemical manipulation of water." Her breath caught. "What are you implying?" "That the so-called frozen footprints were not natural at all," Holmes said softly. "They were created. Fair clever ruse, pouring a solution across the path to form a perfect set of impressions, which then hardened under the night frost. A false trail to suggest an impossible visitor." Lestrade stared in disbelief. "You mean someone made the prints on purpose?" Holmes nodded. "To divert suspicion. Mr. March's death was no accident, but the result of deliberate poisoning. The acid traces in his decanter were not the remnants of an experiment. They were his final drink. Whoever prepared it knew precisely what reaction would escape notice until morning." For the first time, Mrs. Fenwick's voice faltered. "That is absurd." "I had no reason," Holmes cut her off gently. "On the contrary, you had the most powerful reason of all, vindication. Your husband's reputation was destroyed by March's accusation, and you alone possessed the knowledge and the courage to use science as both weapon and disguise. The footprints were your masterpiece, Mrs. Fenwick, a symbol perhaps of guilt that could never melt away." The silence stretched, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Then slowly her hands unclenched. "You cannot prove it," she whispered. Holmes regarded her with calm certainty. "Proof, madam, is merely the shadow of truth awaiting light, and I intend to shine that light directly upon your laboratory." He turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, I suggest we examine her premises at once. We shall find traces of the same freezing compound used upon Frost Lane. If my deductions are correct, it will contain calcium chloride mixed with a stabilizing acid." Mrs. Fenwick closed her eyes. "You will find nothing," she said softly. "It will have melted by now." Holmes's expression hardened. "Perhaps so. But your conscience, madam, may prove less soluble." She said nothing more as Lestrade signaled the constables waiting outside. As we departed, the frost on the windows seemed to shimmer faintly in the weak sunlight. As though mocking the illusion she had crafted, an illusion that was already beginning to crack beneath the warmth of truth. The ride back through the frost-laden streets was a silent one. Holmes sat motionless beside me, his profile sharp against the window's dim reflection, his thoughts clearly turning over the revelations of the morning. Lestrade, opposite us, muttered occasionally to himself, no doubt rehearsing the official report he would have to make. Yet, for all the inspector's confidence, I sensed that Holmes remained unsatisfied. His eyes, half-shuttered though they were, possessed that faint gleam of unrest that always heralded an unsolved detail. When we arrived once more at Frost Lane, the winter light had begun to fade. The house looked colder than before, its walls glittering with thin veils of ice. The constables had gone, leaving only the echo of our boots upon the frozen steps. Holmes paused before the path and gazed again upon the footprints that had started this strange affair. They were still there, ghostly and perfect, frozen like the echo of some impossible visitor. "Do you believe her?" I asked at last. Holmes did not look up. "I believe that Mrs. Fenwick believes her crime untraceable. That, my dear Watson, is not the same as innocence." He crouched once more beside the prince, his breath forming small clouds in the air. "But what intrigues me is the precision. The solution used to harden these impressions could not have been improvised on a whim. It was calculated, measured, and that implies premeditation of a far deeper nature than revenge alone." Lestrade snorted. "You're suggesting she planned it long before her visit?" Holmes straightened, brushing the frost from his knees. "I suggest nothing yet, but the chemical nature of her deception deserves confirmation. We shall return to her laboratory tonight." I stared at him. "Tonight? Surely you don't intend—" "Precisely that," he interrupted, his voice low but firm. "Our dear Mrs. Fenwick is no common poisoner. She is a chemist, perhaps even a visionary in her field. And visionaries have a peculiar weakness. They cannot leave perfection unfinished. If she has destroyed her evidence, she will wish to recreate it, if only to reassure herself that her art was flawless. We shall catch her in the act of remembrance." By the time darkness fell, the frost had thickened into a brittle crust that crackled underfoot. We approached Mrs. Fenwick's townhouse from the alley behind, Holmes moving with the silent assurance of a cat. Through a narrow window at the rear, faint light spilled out onto the snow. Holmes motioned for me to remain still and pressed his face close to the pane. Inside, Mrs. Fenwick stood before her workbench. A lamp burned low beside her, casting a wavering halo of gold about her shoulders. She had shed her outer coat, and her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, revealing hands that worked with precise deliberation. Before her lay a set of flasks, one steaming faintly. Holmes's eyes glinted as he whispered, "As I suspected, the reconstruction of her crime." We watched in silence as she mixed a clear liquid with a handful of white powder, then stirred it carefully. A thin vapor rose, condensing almost instantly into frost upon the edge of the table. She leaned closer, examining the reaction with that unmistakable fascination of a mind absorbed by its own creation. Holmes touched my arm lightly. "We must move now before she completes it." Moments later, we were inside. Holmes picked the lock as deftly as if he were opening a letter. The faint creak of the door made her start violently. She spun, her eyes widening in terror as the lamplight fell upon Holmes's face. "Good evening, Mrs. Fenwick," he said softly. "I see your experiment continues." She backed against the workbench, the flask trembling in her grasp. "You have no right—" "I have every right," Holmes replied, his tone suddenly sharp. "You murdered Edwin March, and you attempted to bury that act beneath the artistry of your science. But your very genius betrayed you. You could not resist improving upon your deception." Her composure cracked, anger flashing through the fear. "He ruined my husband's life. Do you understand what it means to watch brilliance wither in disgrace? March destroyed him, destroyed us. My husband took his own life while March prospered on his stolen work. Tell me, Mr. Holmes, what would you have done?" Holmes regarded her with cool detachment. "I should have sought truth, not vengeance." "Truth?" She laughed bitterly. "You speak of truth as though it were a virtue men like March honored. He mocked me when I asked him to restore my husband's name. He called it folly, a woman's delusion, so I gave him a proof he would never mock again." Her hand tightened upon the flask, and for a dreadful moment I feared she meant to dash it to the ground. Holmes moved swiftly, seizing it from her grasp before she could act. The liquid within was still faintly steaming. "Careful," she hissed. That mixture could freeze a man's flesh in seconds. An admirable invention, Holmes said evenly, setting it aside. But it will serve better as testimony than as weaponry. Lestrade, if you please. The inspector stepped forward from the shadows, having entered quietly through the front. His hand closed around her arm with grim finality. Yet as he did, her eyes caught the light, burning not with guilt but with a strange, sorrowful pride. "You think you've won, Mr. Holmes," she murmured. "But you misunderstand the essence of justice. I did not kill March for myself. I killed him for truth, the truth he stole from my husband. And if your kind call that a crime, then I am guilty indeed." Holmes said nothing as she was led away. His gaze followed her until the door closed behind them, and then he turned back to the bench. He examined the residue within the flask, then the instruments she had arranged with almost obsessive precision. A faint sigh escaped him. "Watson," he said quietly, "you see before you the tragedy of intellect untethered by conscience, a mind capable of transcendent creation, yet driven to destruction for want of humility. Her formula is ingenious, simple calcium chloride mixed with glycerin and a trace of mercuric nitrate. It accelerates freezing tenfold. With such a compound, she could sculpt time itself." He leaned against the bench, his expression unreadable. "And yet she used it to forge a lie." I looked at him, uncertain of his tone. "You almost sound as though you pity her." Holmes's eyes lifted to mine, the firelight glinting within them. "Pity, Watson, is a luxury reserved for those who have not seen the limits of reason. I neither pity nor condemn her. I only observe. The mind that constructs beauty is often the same that courts ruin. In that Mrs. Fenwick is not unique." We left the laboratory in silence, the door closing softly behind us. Outside, the night was painfully still. The frost on the ground sparkled under the gaslights, and for a fleeting moment, I imagined I could still see the faint outline of footprints upon the snow, silent echoes of deceit and sorrow. Holmes paused at the gate, his eyes fixed on the street ahead. "Do you recall, Watson, what I said this morning? That nature conspires to conceal human folly." "Yes," I said. "And you added that it also reveals it." He nodded slowly. "Precisely. In the end, even the coldest deception leaves its trace. One merely has to look long enough for the thaw." He turned and walked into the fog, his silhouette fading into the London mist, while behind us the frost began to glimmer faintly, no longer a mystery, but a monument to a crime as delicate and deliberate as the ice itself. Holmes remained crouched before the frost-laden window for several minutes, his magnifying glass suspended inches above the sill. The faint light of dawn had begun to stretch timidly across the room, giving the frozen panes a dull blue glow. Watson watched as he traced with one long finger the delicate pattern of frost that had crept along the inner edge of the glass. It looked almost as though nature itself had conspired to write a cryptic message in ice. "There is artistry in this, Watson," Holmes murmured at last, his voice low but alive with thought. "Observe how the frost thickens in irregular lines along the bottom edge. This is not the uniform freezing of a winter's night. No, this condensation occurred after a sudden drop in temperature, likely caused by the introduction of chilled air. Someone opened this window at a critical hour. But the window was locked from within when we entered," Watson objected, glancing again toward the latch. "Precisely," Holmes replied, his eyes narrowing. "It was opened and shut again, but not long before the victim's death. A movement made with care but not perfection. Note this hairline crack in the frost. See how it spirals outward like a spider's thread? That, Watson, is where the frozen moisture was disturbed and refrozen. An act performed stealthily, yet nature betrays even the most cautious hand." Before Watson could respond, Lestrade, who had been pacing restlessly near the door, interjected. "Then what are you saying, Mr. Holmes?" "That someone came in through the window?" "We checked outside. Those blasted footprints are the only sign of life near this house." Holmes turned slowly, his gaze sharpening upon the inspector. "My dear Lestrade, the footprints are indeed a sign of life, but not necessarily of movement." Lestrade frowned. "You'll have to explain that one." "All in due course," Holmes replied with faint amusement. He crossed to the hearth and stood regarding the lifeless figure of Edwin March. The dead man still sat in his chair, head bowed, one hand loosely gripping the armrest. The expression upon his face was curiously calm, almost resigned. Holmes bent close, inspecting the man's temples, his lips, and the faint trace of discoloration upon his fingertips. "Watson," he said, What does this remind you of?" Watson leaned in, examining the body as requested. There's no sign of violence. His complexion is pale, though not that of ordinary suffocation. The eyes are clear, the pupils slightly dilated. Perhaps poisoning, something subtle, fast-acting. Holmes nodded approvingly. Good. And yet, if you were to consider the temperature of the room, would you expect the same dilation? Watson hesitated, then shook his head. No, the cold would constrict rather than expand. Then this took place before the full chill set in. Indeed. He died while the air was still warm enough to sustain life. The frost invaded afterward, and that, Watson, is the puzzle that holds the key to everything. Lestrade let out an impatient breath. Frost, footprints, windows, it's all devilish confusing. You're saying the murderer killed him, froze the room, and then vanished into thin air? Holmes smiled faintly, not unkindly. You have a gift for the dramatic, Inspector. But no, vanishing is a trick for conjurers, not criminals. What we are dealing with is a mind that understands precision and patience. He straightened abruptly. I shall require your men to guard the house and to permit no one entry or exit. And I must have at once any records of visitors or tradesmen who came to this lane within the last 48 hours. Even the milkman or postman may provide a clue. Lestrade muttered something under his breath, but nodded and stepped out to issue orders. Holmes returned to his examination, now turning his attention to the fireplace. The ashes had long since cooled, but a faint scent hung in the air, a smell both chemical and earthy, faintly acrid. Holmes leaned in, his nose almost touching the hearthstone. Ammonium nitrate, he murmured. Curious. Watson looked puzzled. Explosives? Not necessarily. It may also be a cooling agent when combined properly with water. A man of scientific inclination could lower the temperature of a space rather dramatically in a short time. Say, enough to freeze a trail of footprints and seal a death chamber in ice. You mean the killer used chemicals to create the frost? Possibly. Or, Holmes said, rising slowly, someone wished to simulate a natural freeze, to suggest that nature herself had played executioner. Watson stared. To mislead us into thinking the conditions of death were beyond human control. Just so. A clever deception, though not quite clever enough. A knock sounded from the doorway. Lestrade reappeared, clutching a folded sheet of paper. Here's the list, Holmes. And there's something else. One of the constables found a broken flask out back near the garden gate. It had frozen over, but he chipped it free. Smells like spirits of some sort. Holmes accepted the item without a word and turned it in the light. The glass was etched faintly along its neck. R. & Comer's Chemical Importers, Limehouse. He nodded to himself. Excellent. We are closing in. He paced toward the window once more, his gaze fixed on the lonely trail outside. The frozen footprints glistened under the dim light of dawn, leading up to the door like a spectral procession. Watson, he said, note their spacing, equidistant, firm, no signs of hesitation. Whoever made them walked with confidence and purpose. And yet... He crouched lower, his tone dropping to a whisper. The impressions are too perfect. No scuffing, no sign of thaw or compression from warmth. They were made after the ground froze. Cast, perhaps, rather than pressed by a living foot. Watson blinked. Cast, you mean precisely? Holmes interrupted, his eyes gleaming. Someone manufactured these footprints, possibly using molds filled with water and frozen to appear genuine. The real visitor left none or took great pains to erase them, but who would go to such lengths? Someone who required the illusion of an impossible visitor. Someone who wished the world to believe a phantom walked to the door of Edwin March. And if that illusion was necessary, then the motive lies not in passion, but in design. Holmes rose swiftly, his decision made. Watson, we return to London at once. Limehouse, I think, will give us our next revelation. There is a certain chemical supplier whose records may tell us who purchased the means to freeze a man's final moments. Lestrade looked incredulous. You're leaving already? The dead tell no more than they must, Holmes replied, drawing his coat around him. But the living, when questioned correctly, often speak volumes. Come, Watson. Time, in this case, is frozen, but our advantage lies in movement. With that, Holmes swept from the chamber, his coat brushing the frost as he passed. Watson followed close behind, glancing once more at the dead man, whose still features seemed to watch them, even as they departed. The frozen footprints shimmered faintly in the pale dawn, and for the briefest instant, Watson could not shake the feeling that they led not merely to a house of death, but to the very edge of reason itself. The fog of London hung low and yellow over the Thames as our hansom cab rattled toward Limehouse, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels blending with the muffled hum of the city waking under the grey light of morning. Holmes sat opposite me, silent and rigid, his long fingers drumming lightly upon his knee in a manner I had learned to associate with swift and complex thought. Every now and then, he would draw from his coat pocket the broken flask recovered from Frost Lane and study it with that peculiar intensity of gaze that seemed to burn through the very object itself. "It is, Watson," he said suddenly, "a most remarkable form of deceit. To freeze a scene so completely, and yet leave the appearance of untouched nature, it speaks of a mind trained in both science and artifice. What we have witnessed is not merely murder, but composition. A man's death staged like a performance." I nodded, though my thoughts were still tangled in the memory of Edwin March's lifeless form. "And yet, Holmes, the purpose escapes me. Why the frozen footprints? Why go to such extremes simply to conceal an ordinary crime?" "Because it was no ordinary crime," Holmes replied sharply. "Our culprit does not wish to hide the deed, Watson, but to elevate it, to make of it something inexplicable, something supernatural. When reason falters, superstition thrives, and the truth remains safe beneath its shadow." As he spoke, the cab turned sharply off the main road, descending into the narrower streets of Limehouse. Here the air was thicker, damp with the smell of tar and salt, the cries of dockmen mingling with the slow churn of ships at anchor. The buildings leaned close together, their windows dull and secretive. Holmes's gaze swept the alleyways with restless precision until at last the cab halted before a narrow brick structure bearing a worn sign, Rutherford & Coby's, chemical importers. Holmes leapt down and paid the driver, his movements brisk. "Keep close, Watson. Limehouse has a habit of swallowing men whole." Inside, the shop was dim and lined with shelves crowded with glass jars, metal canisters, and peculiar instruments that glinted faintly in the murky light. Behind the counter stood a thin man with a sallow face and a nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth. His ink-stained fingers fidgeted with a ledger as Holmes approached. "Good morning," Holmes said pleasantly. "We are making inquiries on behalf of the Yard concerning the purchase of certain chemical agents, specifically ammonium nitrate and chloroethane." The man's eyes darted briefly to the flask in Holmes's hand before he forced a smile. "We serve many clients, sir. I couldn't possibly recall every sale." Holmes's expression did not change, but his tone cooled perceptibly. "Then perhaps your ledger will assist your memory. The matter concerns a death under suspicious circumstances. I should be sorry to involve Scotland Yard in a visit better conducted with discretion." That last word had its intended effect. The man swallowed hard and pulled the ledger from beneath the counter. Holmes leaned forward as the pages turned, his eyes scanning line after line, until one entry caused him to tap a long finger against the margin. "There," he said, 3 days ago. "A bulk purchase of the very compounds in question. Paid in cash, no address given, signed under the name Harcourt. Do you recall this man?" The clerk hesitated, glancing uneasily toward the back room. "A tall gentleman," he said at last. "Neat in dress. Spoke with refinement, like one accustomed to command. He mentioned he was conducting an experiment for preservation, something about stopping decay. He wore dark gloves, though the day was not cold." Holmes's eyes flickered with interest. "And his voice?" "Low, educated, not English, though, perhaps French or Belgian." "Excellent," said Holmes softly. He closed the ledger and laid a coin upon the counter. "You have been most helpful. One last thing. Did he happen to mention where the delivery was to be made?" The clerk nodded. "He requested the items be sent to a storage facility by the river. Warehouse 17, Wharf Lane." Holmes's smile was faint but satisfied. "I am in your debt." Outside once more, the cold air struck us sharply. Holmes turned down a narrow side street, his stride purposeful. "Wharf Lane lies a quarter-mile east. Come, Watson, if fortune favours us, we may yet glimpse the workshop where our phantom Frost was born." We walked briskly through the twisting lanes until the buildings fell away to reveal the sluggish grey flow of the Thames. A line of warehouses stood along the embankment, their wooden doors bolted, their windows clouded by grime. Number 17 loomed at the far end, its padlock crusted with rust. Yet the ground before it bore recent marks, Wheel tracks, faint but visible, even through the thin layer of frost that clung to the stones. Holmes knelt at once, touching the tracks with his bare fingers. "A handcart," he muttered, "moved within the last 12 hours. The frost here is melted along the wheel's passage. Whoever came returned during the early hours of the morning." He straightened and produced a small instrument from his coat pocket, a slender piece of wire tipped with a hooked end. "Lock-picking is an art best practiced with delicacy, Watson. Observe." Within moments, the padlock yielded with a soft click. Holmes eased the door open just enough for us to slip inside. The air was close and carried the faint metallic tang of chemicals. Wooden crates were stacked along the walls, some marked with the familiar label of Rutherford & Co., others unmarked entirely. In the center of the floor stood a table cluttered with glass flasks, tubing and a small metal cylinder capped with frost. Holmes approached it cautiously. "Ah, a portable refrigerant chamber. Ingenious. Our man is no common murderer. He is a craftsman of temperature itself." He touched the rim of the device and drew back instantly. Still cold. This was in use not long ago. As we examined the apparatus, a faint sound reached our ears, the scrape of a boot against the boards above. Holmes's eyes flashed, and he raised a finger for silence. Slowly, he motioned toward a narrow staircase at the back of the warehouse. We ascended step by cautious step until we reached a small loft crowded with crates. A shaft of light filtered through a broken pane, illuminating a dark figure bending over a case of instruments. Holmes moved forward, swift and silent as a shadow. "I would not trouble to conceal your tools, Mr. Harcourt," he said calmly. "You have already betrayed yourself by your choice of refrigerant." The man spun round. He was tall indeed, gaunt with a sharp nose and pale eyes that glittered with both fear and intellect. For a moment he seemed poised to flee, but Holmes blocked his path with the authority of inevitability. "Who are you?" the man demanded hoarsely. "By what right?" "By the right of reason," Holmes interrupted. "And by the death of Edwin March, whose demise you so artfully concealed beneath a veil of ice." The man's lips tightened. "You know nothing of my work." "On the contrary," Holmes said, his tone almost courteous. "I know you to be a chemist of exceptional skill. You have devised a method to extract heat rapidly from enclosed spaces, creating artificial frost. You used it to stage a death that would appear to defy explanation. The question then is not how but why." The man said nothing. His hands, however, clenched slowly at his sides, the knuckles whitening. Holmes took a step closer, his voice dropping. "You see, the late Mr. March was no stranger to scientific inquiry. His papers at the scene spoke of refrigeration processes strikingly similar to your own. You feared exposure or perhaps competition." At that the man gave a sudden bitter laugh. "Exposure? No, Mr. Holmes, he stole my work. My formulas, my apparatus, everything. I sought only to prove that he was no genius, but a thief. I would have ruined his reputation, not his life. But when I confronted him, he struck me. He collapsed in his rage before I could stop him." Holmes's eyes gleamed, the faintest edge of sympathy softening his tone. "And in your panic, you turned to the tools you knew best. You froze the scene to halt decay, to conceal the moment of truth." The man lowered his head, defeated. "I never meant for him to die. Only to show the world the coldness of his deceit." Holmes stood silent for a long moment, then said quietly, "You succeeded all too well." Footsteps sounded below, Lestrade and his men, summoned by Holmes's earlier telegram. As the officers led the prisoner away, Holmes lingered by the window, watching the river's dull gleam through the fog. "The most chilling crimes, Watson," he said softly, "are not those born of hatred but of wounded pride. For pride, when frozen, turns the warmest mind into ice." And as we stepped once more into the pale morning light, I could not help but feel that Frost Lane would forever remain haunted, not by a ghostly figure in the snow, but by the tragic chill of human vanity laid bare under the lens of reason. The bitter wind trailed behind us as we left the warehouse, carrying with it the echo of Lestrade's voice, giving orders to his men. Holmes, however, walked on in silence, his long coat sweeping against the damp cobblestones. I could tell from his rigid bearing that the case, despite its apparent resolution, had not yet rested entirely in his mind. There was a peculiar stillness in his expression, the kind that meant his thoughts were at war with themselves. "You are not satisfied," I ventured. "After several minutes of walking." "Far from it," he murmured. Our friend Mr. Harcourt has confessed to the confrontation, but not to the murder. He claims March collapsed in rage. I found no evidence to refute that. No marks of struggle, no external injuries, no trace of poison or blow. Yet, Watson, a man of March's constitution does not fall dead from anger alone. You suspect something more? I suspect everything, until nothing remains to suspect. He stopped abruptly under a street lamp whose flame flickered in the wind. Harcourt's machinery, ingenious though it is, was not built in secrecy. March had been corresponding for months with investors about a revolutionary freezing process. The prototypes he used bore the same design as Harcourt's. But note, my dear fellow, Harcourt's workshop contained 2 refrigerant cylinders, one empty, one full. Only the former was used on the scene. I frowned. You believe someone else returned after Harcourt fled? Holmes's eyes glittered. Not believe, consider. The crime as it stands lacks its symmetry. I fear we have frozen the truth before it had time to thaw. He hailed a cab, and we rode in silence until we reached Baker Street once again. The familiar warmth of our sitting room contrasted sharply with the frost still clinging to Holmes's coat. He lit his pipe and settled into his chair, his profile sharp against the glow of the fire. For nearly half an hour he sat unmoving, save for the faint rise of smoke curling toward the ceiling. At last he said, "Watson, do you recall the position of March's hand upon discovery?" Yes, clutching the edge of his desk, as though he had been writing when struck. And what did he write? Nothing discernible. The paper was blank. Holmes nodded. So it appeared. Yet I remember distinctly that the fibers were faintly warped, as though exposed to moisture. Not from ink, but condensation. I believe March did write something, Watson, but the freezing process erased it. We may still recover it. He sprang up suddenly and crossed to the cabinet, retrieving a small vial of iodine and a brush. "The paper from Frost Lane, did you bring it?" I opened my case and handed it over. He laid the sheet upon the table, brushed the iodine across its surface and bent low under the lamp. Slowly, faint letters began to emerge, brown against the pale grain of the page. Holmes exhaled sharply through his nose. "There it is." I leaned closer. The words were uneven, as if scrawled in haste. "Not Harcourt. Code from within." Good heavens, I breathed. He was trying to name his killer. Holmes's expression hardened. Indeed. And he distinguishes Harcourt from the culprit. Code from within, what could that mean? He rose and began pacing the room in swift, deliberate strides. March was a scientist obsessed with the control of temperature. His experiments concerned not mere refrigeration, but cryonic preservation, keeping organic tissue intact by halting decay entirely. The process required an energy source and a catalyzing agent. Harcourt supplied the chemical principle. But who provided the energy? Before I could reply, there came a brisk knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a telegram upon a tray. Holmes snatched it up, scanned its contents, and smiled faintly. As I expected. Lestrade reports that upon examining March's accounts, a regular payment was made every month to a Miss Clara Venn, an artist by trade, residing in Kensington. She visited March frequently, under the pretext of sketching his laboratory apparatus. Curious, is it not? Holmes threw on his coat again. Come, Watson. The trail is warming despite the frost. Kensington lay shrouded in twilight when we arrived. The street was quiet, lined with tall houses whose windows glowed faintly through drawn curtains. Miss Venn's residence proved to be a modest but tasteful flat, its walls adorned with sketches and oil studies of scientific instruments, rendered with remarkable precision. A faint smell of turpentine lingered in the air. The lady herself received us with calm composure, though her hands trembled slightly as she motioned us to sit. She was of about 30 years, with pale features and eyes of an unusual grey hue. Keen, though marked with fatigue, "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I feared you might come." "That spares me the trouble of explanation," Holmes replied gently. "You were acquainted with the late Mr. March." "I was," she said softly. "He was my patron. He commissioned drawings of his machines, said he needed them for investors. I never imagined how deeply his work ran, or how deeply you were involved in it," Holmes asked, watching her closely. Her lips parted, then pressed shut. "He trusted me." "He said my precision of hand was unmatched. I only recorded what he built." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Miss Venn, you are an artist, but also, if I am not mistaken, a former student of the Royal College of Chemistry. Your hand betrays the steadiness of one accustomed to measurement, not merely composition. And your sketches, here, see, contain details of wiring and mechanism no artist would include, unless she understood their function. A flush rose in her cheeks. You've done your research. I prefer to call it observation, Holmes said dryly. Now let us cease the dance. You knew of Harcourt's designs. You improved them. March took credit. When Harcourt confronted him, you saw an opportunity. To remove both rivals at once, she stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. That's not true. Then tell us what is, Holmes said, voice cool but not unkind. She wavered, then sat again, her shoulders trembling. I went to March that night. I begged him to stop, to give Harcourt the credit he deserved. He laughed at me, said men like Harcourt and I were tools to be used. I lost my temper. I turned his machine upon him to frighten him, not to kill. But he collapsed before I could reverse the process. I swear it wasn't meant to happen. The freezing device you constructed, Holmes said slowly, drew heat not from the air, but from the very body of the subject. Cold from within. That was March's final message. You perfected what Harcourt began. Tears welled in her eyes. I wanted him to live, to understand what it felt like to be powerless. Holmes regarded her in silence for several moments, then said quietly, The law will take its course, Miss Venn, but I confess I see in this tragedy not malice, but wounded genius. Two minds frozen by pride, each destroying the other in their thirst for recognition. As we departed, I glanced back through the frosted pane. She sat motionless, her face half lit by the fire, a figure carved in sorrow and shadow. Outside the night had deepened, the mist rolling in thick from the river. Holmes walked slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. Remarkable, he murmured. The chill that killed March was not chemical but moral, a coldness of ambition. In seeking to halt decay, they froze themselves. He stopped, glancing toward me with a faint smile. Come, Watson. Let us go home. There is warmth enough yet at Baker Street to thaw even my thoughts. And as we turned into the gaslit avenue, I could not help but feel that, beneath the frost and science and intellect, there pulsed a quiet tragedy, one that even the great Sherlock Holmes, with all his logic, could only contemplate in silence. The following morning dawned grey and heavy, with a fine drizzle turning the streets to silver ribbons beneath the gas lamps. Holmes sat at the breakfast table, untouched tea cooling beside him, the Times spread open but unread. His gaze was fixed upon nothing in particular, that peculiar stillness about him, which meant his mind was engaged far beyond the confines of Baker Street. I had learned not to disturb him during such intervals, yet the silence stretched so long that even I, accustomed to his moods, began to feel its weight. At last, without preamble, he said, Watson, does it strike you as curious that Miss Venn, so exact in her craft, made no attempt to destroy the evidence of her handiwork? Her notes, her apparatus, her correspondence, all were neatly preserved. I lowered my paper. Perhaps she wished to confess, to bear the consequence. Perhaps, Holmes murmured, his tone distant. And yet confession and contrition seldom coexist so tidily with preparation and precision. No, Watson, there is a pattern here still incomplete. He rose abruptly, paced to the window, and peered through the wavering glass at the carriages passing below. Lestrade will have her in custody by now, but I suspect her guilt is of a different flavor. She may have turned the device upon March, but I doubt she constructed it alone. Then who? Patience, my dear fellow. The final frost has yet to melt. He strode to his desk and began rifling through the case papers, selecting several sheets that bore March's notes and sketches. Observe this schematic. You will see an energy conduit labeled HM. Miss Venn's sketches omit this entirely, yet the component existed in the actual apparatus found at Frost Lane. Then someone else modified it? Precisely. But who? He paused, his eyes narrowing. March was no engineer, and Harcourt, though capable, lacked the resources for such precision machining. There must be a third mind, someone supplying both material and money, someone content to let others take the credit until the experiment yielded results worth claiming. Before I could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a letter upon a silver tray. Special delivery, Mr. Holmes. Came not 5 minutes ago. Holmes took it, examined the seal, and his expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "From Scotland Yard," he said, tearing it open. His eyes flicked rapidly over the contents, and then he handed it to me. The note was brief. "Miss Venn found lifeless in her cell this morning. No sign of struggle. Apparent cause, suffocation. A residue of frost about the lips and fingertips. Request your immediate presence." Lestrade. "Good heavens," I exclaimed. "Frost again!" Holmes's face was grave. "The cold has not finished its work, Watson. The hand that slew March now seeks to silence the witness who could speak against it." Within the hour we were at Newgate, where the body of Miss Venn lay upon a narrow cot, pale as marble. A faint rime of ice clung to her lashes. The cell was dry, the air cold but ordinary. No sign of the elaborate machinery that had haunted our previous encounters. Lestrade, looking both weary and bewildered, met us at the door. "Damned if I can make sense of it," he muttered. "The guards swear no one entered." The key never left my sight. Holmes bent over the body, his movements meticulous, his expression unreadable. After several minutes he straightened and gestured toward the narrow window high above the cot. "Unbar that, if you please." A constable fetched a ladder and Holmes examined the sill. He scraped away a faint crust of white with his fingernail, then sniffed it. Ammonium nitrate again. Someone discharged a freezing agent through this opening from the outside. The killer had only to release the vapor into the cell, knowing it would asphyxiate her quietly, while leaving his signature upon the corpse. Lestrade swore under his breath. But who could have done it? None of her accomplices, if she had any, knew where she was kept. "Not so," said Holmes softly. "The information was in the evening papers. An accidental disclosure, no doubt aided by someone within the police who received a handsome fee for the indiscretion. The killer required only one night to finish the experiment he began with March." He turned to me, eyes gleaming with sudden intensity. "Do you recall, Watson, the anonymous investor March wrote to regarding his cryonic preservation process? The one whose correspondence was signed only with the initials HM?" I nodded. "You think?" "I know." Holmes's voice sharpened. "The hand that financed March's folly, supplied Harcourt's chemicals, and guided Miss Venn's designs from the shadows, all belong to a single intellect. And I suspect we shall find that intellect hidden not in the alleys of Limehouse or the garrets of Kensington, but in the salons of London's upper crust. That afternoon we drove to Belgravia, where a certain Lord Henry Mortlake resided, a man of wealth, learning, and notorious eccentricity. Holmes had spoken of him before, a dilettante of science, known for funding ventures of dubious morality under the guise of progress. His house was a palace of polished marble and electric lamps that burned with a ghostly hum. We were shown into a drawing-room where Mortlake awaited, a tall figure with silver hair and a smile too smooth to be trusted. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice cultured and measured, "to what do I owe the honor?" Holmes inclined his head. "To frost, my lord." "And to the death it brings," Mortlake chuckled softly. "Ah, still speaking in riddles, I see. You must forgive me. I have little interest in melodrama." "Then allow me to speak plainly," said Holmes, stepping forward. "You funded March's research into thermal inversion. You provided Harcourt the necessary compounds. You employed Miss Venn to improve the device. And when she proved too clever, you silenced her." Mortlake's expression did not change. "So you have quite the imagination, Mr. Holmes. If I financed a dozen scientific projects, must I answer for each failure?" "Only for those that end in death," Holmes replied coolly. "You sought to patent the process yourself, but March intended to expose your role. Miss Venn, discovering your deception, threatened to do the same. You could not allow either to speak." For the briefest instant, Mortlake's eyes flickered. Then he smiled again. "Your theories are delightful, yet without proof. They are merely words in the fog." Holmes produced from his pocket a folded document, the faint brown traces of March's hidden writing visible beneath the lamplight. This note was recovered from March's desk. "Not Harcourt, cold from within." "You were the cold, Lord Mortlake. The power behind the experiment, the chill at its core. And this," he drew forth a small crystal vial capped with metal, "was found in Miss Venn's studio, labeled Property of HM. It contains the final compound, yours. The handwriting matches that of your private correspondence." For a moment Mortlake stood utterly still. Then, with a laugh that chilled the air, he said, "You are clever, Holmes. But cleverness is only half the battle." He reached for a bell-pull, but Holmes's hand shot out, catching his wrist. "I should not do that, my lord. The yard waits below. Mortlake's composure fractured. "You think you can touch me? I am beyond your petty laws." "Perhaps," Holmes said softly, "but not beyond consequence." As Lestrade's men entered, Mortlake's expression curdled into something between rage and despair. "You do not understand," he spat. "I was on the verge of conquering time itself, of halting death. They were all afraid of progress. You call it murder. I call it preservation." Holmes's voice was quiet. "You sought to preserve life by freezing it, and in doing so you extinguished it. You mistook stillness for immortality." Mortlake was taken away, shouting of science and destiny, his words echoing through the marble halls until they faded into silence. That night, back at Baker Street, the rain fell harder and the fire burned low. Holmes sat with his violin in hand but did not play. He gazed into the embers, his face unreadable. "In every age," he said finally, "there are men who believe they can outwit nature. But nature, Watson, is a patient adversary. It freezes what it must until the thaw of truth returns. And as I watched him in the dim glow of the fire, I knew the case of the frozen footprints would linger long after the snow had melted, an eternal reminder that even the coldest genius cannot escape the warmth of justice." The days that followed Lord Mortlake's arrest were curiously subdued. London, with its endless appetite for sensation, had already begun to turn the tragedy into spectacle. Newspapers paraded sketches of the eccentric nobleman, detailing his experiments in artificial cold with the same relish they once reserved for foreign wars. Yet within the walls of Baker Street, Holmes was uncharacteristically silent. He spent long hours seated by the window, pipe in hand, his gaze distant. I suspected that something in Mortlake's final words still troubled him. One evening, as I sorted through my notes of the case, Holmes suddenly spoke. "Watson, does it not strike you as odd that Mortlake, so careful, so methodical, should have allowed himself to be captured so easily?" I looked up. He was cornered, Holmes. You had the vial, the handwriting, the testimony. What choice had he? Holmes tapped his pipe against the grate. "A man like Mortlake always has a choice." He was too composed, even in defeat. His talk of conquering time was no mere bluster. It was a hint. "There is something unfinished here, something that slipped past us in the fog. You think he had an accomplice, perhaps more than one, or perhaps something he left behind." He rose abruptly, crossing to his desk where he opened a small wooden box. Within lay the crystal vial we had taken from Mortlake's estate. Its contents, a faintly shimmering frost, had not melted even after days at room temperature. "Observe, Watson, still intact. When exposed to air, it should have dissipated within hours. Yet it endures." I leaned closer. "Remarkable. You believe it may hold some further clue?" Holmes nodded. "I intend to find out. Tonight." It was near midnight when we set out for Mortlake's laboratory, a small annex attached to the rear of his Belgravia mansion. The place had been sealed by Scotland Yard, but Holmes's persuasive tongue and Lestrade's curiosity earned us discreet access. The air inside was dry, heavy with the faint scent of chemicals and metal. Rows of instruments stood beneath dust cloths, and in the center of the chamber, the remnants of March's final machine loomed like a skeleton, pipes, valves, and coils of copper frozen mid-gesture. Holmes moved with careful precision, his lantern casting thin spears of light across the walls. "Mortlake's genius lay not in invention but in application," he murmured. He took fragments from others, the chemist's insight, the artisan's hand, and wove them into a tapestry of peril. He crouched beside a locked cabinet and deftly picked the latch. Inside, neatly stacked, were notebooks bound in black leather. He opened the topmost volume, scanning its contents rapidly. "As I suspected," he said softly. "He was working on a secondary prototype, one that required no direct operator." "A self-activating device?" I asked. "Precisely. A mechanism capable of discharging its freezing agent automatically, perhaps triggered by motion or temperature change. If such a device exists, it could still be functional somewhere in the city." A chill passed through me that had little to do with the damp air. "Holmes, you don't think he managed to set one loose?" Holmes's eyes gleamed in the lamplight. "If he meant his talk of preservation literally, it is possible he prepared a chamber, an environment sealed against time itself. A vault of cold awaiting its master's return." Before I could reply, a sound interrupted us, a faint metallic creak, followed by a slow hiss. Holmes's head snapped up. From behind the far wall, a soft vapor began to curl into the room, glimmering faintly in the lantern light. "Back!" he shouted, pulling me toward the door. "It's the compound." We barely cleared the threshold before a gust of frigid air swept through the lab. Within moments, frost traced delicate veins across the walls, and the glass instruments cracked with sharp, brittle notes. The temperature plummeted so swiftly that our breath hung like smoke. Holmes slammed the door and turned the key in the lock. So Mortlake left his legacy indeed. A safeguard or a trap for the curious. He glanced at me, a faint smile beneath his urgency. "It appears we have interrupted the future he intended to preserve." By dawn, after consulting Lestrade and a small team of chemical specialists, the chamber was carefully dismantled. The vapor, once analyzed, proved to contain a form of cryogenic compound so volatile that mere exposure to moisture could trigger a cascading freeze. Mortlake had been on the verge of weaponizing the very phenomenon that had killed March, yet Holmes was not satisfied. "There is still one piece missing," he said later that day, pacing our sitting room. Mortlake could not have managed the engineering alone, and his notes refer to correspondence sent northward to a facility designated only as the Hollow. "Scotland?" I ventured. "Possibly. Or the northern reaches of England. Either way, we must follow the frost to its source." Thus, within 48 hours, we were aboard a northbound train, the landscape beyond our window a blur of moors and rain-soaked fields. Holmes remained silent for most of the journey, his mind clearly fixed upon the web that Mortlake had woven. Only once did he speak, almost to himself. "Men such as Mortlake never die alone. Their shadows linger in others who share their vision." By the time we reached Durham, the weather had turned bitter. The local constabulary, forewarned by telegram, directed us toward a disused mine some miles from the city, a place known to locals as Hollow Grange. According to records, Mortlake had purchased the site under a false name several years prior. We arrived at dusk. The mine's entrance yawned black against the hillside, a breath of cold air seeping outward. Inside, our lanterns revealed narrow tunnels lined with old rails and rusted tools. Yet deeper within, the walls shifted from stone to metal, and the faint hum of machinery reached our ears. Holmes's expression hardened. He built his vault, after all. In the center of the cavern stood a vast cylinder of iron, half buried in frost, connected to a network of pipes that pulsed faintly with pale light. The air was frigid, each breath stinging the lungs. Holmes approached the control panel and brushed away the ice, revealing a plaque, Mortlake Preservation Chamber No. 1. Beneath it, an engraving, "The body is but a vessel for the mind eternal." Watson, ever the man of action, tried to steady his lantern, but it trembled slightly in my grasp. "You think he meant to freeze himself?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Or someone else. Look here." He pointed to a narrow window set into the chamber's side. Within, through the frost-blurred glass, a pale figure lay motionless, clad in white, face obscured by ice. I felt the blood drain from my face. Good Lord. Holmes peered closer, his breath fogging the glass. "It is not Mortlake. The stature is wrong, the hands too small. A woman." He scraped away a thin layer of frost, and the features beneath emerged faintly. The delicate cheekbones, the fair hair frozen in stillness. "Miss Venn," he whispered. "She never died in her cell?" The words hung in the air like the frost itself. The revelation struck with terrible clarity. Mortlake had staged her death, replaced her body, and hidden the real woman within his vault, preserving her as both subject and proof. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "we stand upon the edge of a crime that transcends death itself." The hum of the machinery deepened, as though aware of our presence. Holmes turned to the control levers, his mind racing. He meant to return here one day, to awaken her or to test the limits of his invention. But that day shall never come. He reached for the switch. "Stand back, Watson." With a decisive motion, he cut the power. The lights dimmed, the hum faded, and for a long moment the only sound was the crackling of thawing frost. Inside the chamber, the pale figure seemed to sigh, as if in the warmth of returning life she were finally at peace. Holmes remained silent, his expression grave but resolute. "Let it end here," he murmured. "Mortlake sought to preserve what time should take. But there is mercy in decay, Watson. Without it, there can be no renewal. As we stepped out into the freezing dawn, the first light touched the moors like a promise. And though the frost clung stubbornly to the earth, I knew that somewhere beneath it, spring waited still. Holmes and I stood in silence outside the mine for some time, watching the first faint blush of dawn creep over the horizon. The bitter wind swept through the heather, carrying with it the last chill remnants of Mortlake's terrible genius. Holmes's gaze was fixed upon the black mouth of the tunnel, his features set in that expression I had come to recognize, a blend of deep thought and quiet melancholy. I did not speak. I knew better than to intrude upon the workings of his mind at such moments. At last he turned to me. "Watson, it is a rare thing to see a man's intellect turned so completely against the natural order. Mortlake sought not wealth nor notoriety, but dominion over time itself. Therein lies the most dangerous of human delusions, the belief that knowledge alone confers the right to transcend consequence." I nodded slowly. And yet Holmes' brilliance was undeniable. To create such a device, if one may call it that, required a level of mastery far beyond ordinary men. "Genius," Holmes said quietly, "is a double-edged blade. In the wrong hands it carves only ruin." We descended the slope toward the carriage that awaited us, our boots crunching through frost-hardened soil. Lestrade's men were still at work sealing the mine's entrance, and a small contingent of constables guarded the strange chamber within. As we passed, Holmes paused, his keen eyes taking in every detail. "Ensure the vault is dismantled with care," he instructed the chief constable. "There may yet be residues of the compound. Even a trace could render the air unbreathable." The man nodded stiffly, clearly unnerved. "Aye, Mr. Holmes, we'll handle it as you say." During the return journey to London, Holmes remained withdrawn, gazing out at the bleak countryside. Only once did he speak. "There is something I cannot reconcile, Watson. If Mortlake intended Miss Venn to be preserved indefinitely, how did he mean to revive her? His notes made no mention of any restoration process." I thought for a moment. Perhaps he hadn't yet found one. Holmes shook his head. No, he was too deliberate for half-measures. He must have believed resurrection possible. The question is, did he discover how? It was not until we were once again seated in our familiar quarters at Baker Street that the final thread revealed itself. Holmes, restless as ever, had retrieved Mortlake's notebooks from his satchel and was leafing through them at a feverish pace. The faint winter sunlight filtered through the curtains, catching the smoke from his pipe in languid spirals. "Watson," he said suddenly, "do you recall Mortlake's repeated references to cycles of inversion?" I nodded, remembering the cryptic phrase scrawled in several margins. Yes, though I never understood what he meant. Neither did I until now. Holmes rose, crossed to the mantel, and drew a line of chalk across its surface. He was not merely experimenting with temperature, but with the very exchange of states, heat for cold, life for stillness. The concept is drawn from the early theories of chemical polarity. What if, in freezing the body, he sought not to kill but to suspend the soul's departure, to invert the process of dying itself? I felt a shiver. "Holmes, you speak as though he were attempting immortality." He met my gaze. "Precisely. And that, my dear Watson, is the truest madness of all." There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her face pale. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but there's a gentleman below, says he's from the ministry, insists it's urgent." Holmes's brows lifted. "Show him up." Moments later, a tall grave man entered, dressed in a dark overcoat and bowler hat. He introduced himself as Mr. Fairfax, a representative of the Home Office. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said with a curt nod. "I have come regarding the Mortlake affair. The Crown has taken an interest in certain aspects of the case." Holmes motioned him to sit. "I expected as much. The potential applications of Mortlake's discovery would not escape official notice." Fairfax's expression did not change. "The compound found in Mortlake's laboratory has been transferred to a secure facility. We believe it may hold strategic significance. The ministry intends to continue research under controlled conditions." Holmes's pipe slipped from his hand, landing softly upon the carpet. For a long moment he said nothing. When he did speak, his voice was low, almost dangerous. "You intend to replicate his work?" "Under supervision, yes," Fairfax replied calmly. "Mortlake's ambitions were misguided, but his methods may yield benefits, medical, military, or otherwise. The government cannot allow such potential to vanish. I saw the flicker of fury in Holmes's eyes before he masked it beneath composure. You play with fire, sir. Mortlake's work was an affront to nature and to decency alike. If you persist, you risk repeating his tragedy on a national scale. Fairfax stood, adjusting his gloves. Progress, Mr. Holmes, is seldom achieved without peril. Good day to you both. When the door closed behind him, Holmes remained motionless. Then, with sudden energy, he strode to the desk, seized Mortlake's notebooks and tossed them into the fire. The pages curled and blackened, the inked symbols twisting into smoke. "Holmes," I exclaimed. "Surely you cannot—" "I can and I must," he said grimly. "Knowledge without conscience is the ruin of mankind. Mortlake's folly shall not be repeated, not while I live." The flames devoured the last of the parchment, leaving only the faint scent of scorched paper. For a while neither of us spoke. The fire's glow painted his features in stark relief. Sharp, thoughtful, weary. "Do you think they will stop?" I asked quietly. He sighed. "No, Watson. The hunger for mastery never ends. But perhaps we may delay its feast." He turned his gaze toward the window, where snow had begun to fall once more, soft and soundless upon the street below. "The world grows colder, my friend, not in climate but in heart. We must remain vigilant, lest reason freeze alongside compassion." The following morning brought a subdued calm to Baker Street. Holmes busied himself with a new set of chemical experiments, his mind already seeking fresh challenges. Yet I sensed the weight of Mortlake's shadow lingered upon him. From time to time he would pause, staring into the distance as though listening for echoes of a mind too brilliant and too lost for the world that bore it. Weeks passed before he finally spoke of it again. We were seated before the hearth one quiet evening, the gaslight soft upon the walls. Holmes leaned back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Do you know, Watson," he said, "I sometimes wonder if Mortlake was not entirely wrong. Time is indeed the greatest adversary of mankind. But the victory he sought lies not in freezing the body. It lies in preserving truth." He smiled faintly, that familiar glimmer of irony in his eyes. "So long as men continue to seek understanding without surrendering their humanity, perhaps we shall not yet be lost in the cold." I closed my notebook, watching the fire burn low. "And if the frost returns?" I asked. Holmes rose, reaching for his violin. "Then we shall trace its footprints once more," he said quietly. "And this time, Watson, we shall ensure they melt away." The first notes drifted through the air, clear, haunting, and filled with the fragile beauty of things that cannot last. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing London in silence, as if the city itself were holding its breath, and thus ended the case of the frozen footprints, a mystery that began with the cold and ended with the faint, flickering warmth of a man's resolve against the chill of ambition. Several months had passed since the dreadful business of Mortlake and his frozen vault, yet I often found my thoughts returning to that bitter moor and the pale figure entombed within its icy chamber. London had long forgotten the affair, of course. The papers had shifted their attention to fresher scandals, but Holmes and I carried its residue in silence. The case had chilled us both, not merely in temperature but in spirit. There had been something unnatural about it, something that had pressed too near to the boundaries of life and death for either of us to forget easily. Holmes, however, had resumed his ordinary habits, or so it seemed. He rose early, read the morning papers with unerring precision, and filled our sitting room with the chemical odors of new experiments. Yet there were moments, often in the quiet hours before dawn, when I would find him standing at the window, his silhouette faintly haloed by the gaslight, gazing out into the fog-bound street, as though searching for a shadow that refused to leave him. It was during one such morning that the next curious turn of the affair began. A knock came at our door, sharp, urgent, and out of place at so early an hour. Mrs. Hudson's voice followed. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's of the utmost importance." Holmes exchanged a glance with me and murmured, "It seems the frost has not quite melted, Watson." "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson." The visitor was a tall, narrow-faced man dressed in a heavy overcoat, his hair streaked with premature grey. He removed his hat with trembling fingers. "Mr. Holmes, I am Dr. Arthur Pembroke of St. Jude's Hospital. I believe I have come upon something that may concern you." "Indeed." Holmes gestured toward the armchair by the fire. "Pray be seated, Dr. Pembroke. What troubles you?" The man hesitated, glancing toward me as if unsure whether to speak freely. Holmes waved a hand impatiently. "Dr. Watson is both my colleague and my conscience. Proceed without restraint." Pembroke took a breath. "It concerns a patient, or rather what I first believed to be one. A woman was brought to our hospital 3 days ago. She was discovered on the outskirts of Durham, near a disused mine. The locals thought her dead, yet within hours of being moved to warmth her pulse began to return. The attending physician called it a miracle. I call it something else." Holmes leaned forward, the intensity in his eyes sharpening. "Describe her." "She is fair-haired, of slight build, perhaps 30 years of age. No signs of decomposition. Her temperature was abnormally low, yet her skin unblemished. There was also an engraving, faint but legible, upon a metal clasp about her wrist. It read Venn, I started, but Holmes's reaction was instantaneous. He rose so abruptly that his chair tipped backward. "Good heavens, Watson, Miss Venn lives." Pembroke looked bewildered. "You know her?" Holmes turned toward the hearth, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "We believed her long dead. If what you say is true, Dr. Pembroke, she has been preserved exactly as Mortlake intended. His cursed contraption has succeeded beyond even his own design." Pembroke nodded uneasily. "That was my fear. I have studied her condition carefully. She breathes yet remains insensible, as though her mind were lost in some deep, unnatural sleep. There are traces of an unfamiliar chemical in her blood. I brought samples with me, should you wish to examine them." Holmes extended his hand. "Leave them here. I shall conduct an analysis immediately. In the meantime, you must ensure her safety. No word of this reaches the press, or the ministry will claim her as their property." The doctor hesitated. "But why would they—" "Because, my dear sir," Holmes interrupted, "in her veins lies proof that Mortlake's discovery did not die with him, and men of ambition will stop at nothing to harness it." Within the hour, Holmes had cleared his work table, assembling his array of flasks, reagents, and the delicate instruments that always reminded me of an organist at his pipes. I watched as he tested the sample, the faint blue liquid bubbling and releasing a thin plume of vapor that shimmered faintly in the lamplight. When at last he looked up, his expression was grim. "The compound is a derivative of Mortlake's cryogenic serum, but modified. There are stabilizing agents not present in the original formula. Someone has refined it." "Refined it?" I echoed. "Then Mortlake was not working alone." "Precisely. His work has been continued." That evening, Holmes and I traveled north once more, reaching St. Jude's under cover of darkness. The hospital, a solemn stone building nestled on the edge of the moors, was eerily quiet. Dr. Pembroke guided us through a side corridor to a dimly lit ward, where a single bed stood apart from the others. There she lay, Miss Venn. Her face, serene and pale as snow, bore no trace of the months that had passed. Her hands rested lightly upon the coverlet, and her chest rose and fell in the faintest rhythm of life. It was as though time itself had paused to watch her breathe. Holmes bent over her, studying every detail. "The temperature of the skin remains below normal." "Fascinating. Observe, Watson, the faint crystalline residue at the base of the neck. That is no natural secretion. It is the compound's last whisper, clinging to the vessel it preserved." He turned to Pembroke. "You say she regained her pulse upon warming?" "Yes, slowly, almost imperceptibly. It was as if the heart remembered what it had once done and began again by instinct." Holmes's expression softened briefly. "Then Mortlake's folly has produced one mercy at least. She may yet awaken fully. Do you believe she will recover?" I asked. "That, Watson, depends not on medicine but on will. The mind must return of its own accord. But if she does awaken, then she may hold the final secret Mortlake sought to hide." For 2 days we remained in Durham. Holmes scarcely left her side, alternating between analysis and quiet observation. He questioned the nurses, examined the instruments that had been found near the mine, and spent long hours comparing notes. On the third morning, as dawn bled through the frost-streaked windows, Miss Venn stirred, her eyelids fluttered once, twice, and then she drew a deep, trembling breath. I rushed forward, but Holmes held out a hand, motioning for silence. Slowly her eyes opened, clear, blue, and filled with confusion. She looked around the room, her lips parting to speak, but only a whisper escaped. "Where is he?" Holmes's tone was gentle but precise. "Do you mean Lord Mortlake?" She blinked, tears forming. He said he would return. He said he would bring me back when the world was ready. Holmes exhaled softly. You have returned, Miss Venn, but not by his hand. The world may never be ready for what he began. Her gaze shifted toward him, a faint spark of understanding dawning. You stopped him. Yes, Holmes said quietly, but others will try to take his place. She closed her eyes again, her voice a whisper. Then you must stop them too. And with that, exhaustion claimed her once more. Holmes straightened, the light of fierce purpose kindling behind his calm exterior. Watson, he said, the case is not over. Mortlake's resurrection has begun, and the next chapter lies not in the grave, but in the laboratories of men who think themselves gods. He turned toward the window, where the pale sun struggled to pierce the winter mist. We must move swiftly, before the frost spreads again. Holmes spent the remainder of that day formulating a plan with a meticulous attention to detail that both awed and unsettled me. The frost that had haunted Mortlake's crimes was no longer a matter of the past. It lingered in the form of his successors, men and perhaps women whose ambition had been stoked by the preserved legacy of his work. Holmes had already traced fragments of correspondence, cryptic and unsigned, that suggested clandestine meetings and secret laboratories scattered across the northern counties. His deduction was that Mortlake's influence had extended far beyond the isolated mine, leaving seeds of ambition ready to germinate in the hands of those with fewer scruples and greater means. We left Durham at dusk, the air crisp and clean after a brief snowfall that blanketed the moors in white silence. Holmes remained unusually contemplative during the journey southward, his eyes fixed on the passing landscape. He spoke little, allowing the rhythmic clatter of the train to provide a backdrop to his thoughts. I took the opportunity to review the notes we had gathered, attempting to trace the sequence of Mortlake's experiments and the timeline of Miss Venn's preservation. Despite my careful attention, the sheer ingenuity and audacity of the devices left me feeling both amazed and uneasy. Once in London, Holmes directed our course to a discreet inn on the outskirts of Clerkenwell, where a contact of his, a chemist and occasional informant, had arranged a meeting. The inn's parlour was dimly lit, its windows frosted along the edges, the fireplace sputtering weakly against the creeping cold of the evening. Holmes greeted the man, Professor Langford, whose reputation in chemical engineering was rivaled only by his eccentricity, with a brief nod and a curt, "Langford, I trust you have news of the northern laboratories." The professor, a wiry man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, rose and handed Holmes a bundle of papers. "I have been investigating the shipments from Mortlake's estate. Certain compounds marked with the seal of HM have been traced to laboratories in Newcastle, Leeds and Sheffield. Whoever continues his work does so under considerable secrecy, but there are patterns." Holmes's eyes gleamed as he examined the papers. Patterns, indeed. Locations, recipients, chemical quantities. The frost spreads like a contagion, yet the method is precise. To observe, Watson, the signature here, the calculations for thermal inversion, the addition of stabilizing agents. It is Mortlake's hand, unmistakable. Someone has studied his notes in detail and is attempting to replicate the preservation process. And Miss Venn, I asked, could they have intentions toward her? Holmes's gaze sharpened. Undoubtedly. She is the key, the proof that Mortlake's theories were not mere fantasy. If she were to awaken fully, the knowledge of her condition could be exploited, either to further science or to grant power to men unworthy of it. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the inn door. Langford opened it cautiously, revealing a courier dressed in a plain coat holding a sealed envelope. Holmes tore it open with deliberate care. The contents were brief. The North Laboratories will be active tomorrow night. A demonstration of the preservation method will be made. Attendance is selective. Watch the frost. It will lead you to the next step. A friend Holmes's hand tightened around the paper. We must depart immediately, Watson. If the letter is genuine, the opportunity to observe their methods will vanish before we can intervene. Moreover, it may give us the clues we need to prevent further misuse of Mortlake's work. By nightfall, we were aboard a northbound carriage, our horses urging us through sleet and mud. The countryside had assumed a spectral quality beneath the moon, the frost glinting faintly on fence posts and hedgerows. Holmes, seated opposite me, was silent for the first stretch of the journey, his mind clearly occupied with the calculations of timing, distances, and probable locations. He had plotted the coordinates from the letter, anticipating both the site and the method of the demonstration. As the carriage rattled along the final stretch toward a remote industrial estate, the outline of buildings emerged from the darkness. A tall chimney emitted a faint plume of smoke, and narrow windows flickered with light. Holmes leaned forward, speaking in a low, controlled voice. "Observe, Watson. They have chosen a location both isolated and accessible, industrial enough to conceal the work, but close enough to the city to allow discreet attendance. The frost will manifest within the demonstration itself, leaving a trail for those who understand the principle. We approached the entrance cautiously, our figures merging with the shadows." Holmes produced a pair of goggles and small respirators, explaining that the air could contain residual compounds capable of inducing extreme hypothermia if inhaled directly. "Mortlake's legacy is not merely chemical," he said. "It is environmental, a manipulation of the very medium in which life and temperature coexist." Inside, the laboratory was vast, illuminated by oil lamps and punctuated with banks of machinery that hissed and hissed again with the release of cooling vapors. Several men in lab coats moved deliberately among the apparatus, calibrating instruments and adjusting valves. On a raised platform, a cylindrical chamber awaited its subject, a design unmistakably derivative of Mortlake's own preservation device. Holmes's expression was one of intense calculation. "They have replicated the principles exactly, yet they differ in execution. See here, the compound's dispersal is automated through a mechanical system rather than manual operation. This indicates a refinement, an understanding beyond Mortlake himself." I swallowed hard. "And the subject?" Holmes's eyes were coldly analytical. "We are here to observe, not to intervene. Yet we shall not allow catastrophe. Watch the frost, Watson. Its path will reveal both the practitioner's hand and the sequence of the experiment." As the demonstration began, the vapors coiled in delicate ribbons, spreading outward and encasing instruments, tables, and even air currents in a shimmering frost. Holmes moved like a shadow through the perimeter, tracing the invisible patterns with his gaze, noting the flow of gas, the speed of crystallization, and the points at which it condensed most heavily. "The pattern is deliberate," he whispered. "See how the frost tracks the motion of the chamber's operator. Whoever stands at the control lever leaves their signature in the environment itself. It is a method of authentication, subtle and elegant, a logical flourish worthy of Mortlake, yet applied with a cunning mind that may surpass him." Minutes passed, the frost spreading with silent precision, before the operator, a man in a dark coat, stepped back and removed his goggles. The face was partially shadowed, yet the resemblance to Mortlake was unmistakable. Yet his features were younger, sharper, more calculating, a protégé perhaps, or an heir to Mortlake's ambition. Holmes's lips tightened. "Watson, observe closely. This is the culmination of the frozen footprints we have traced from Durham to Belgravia, from St. Jude's to this northern estate. The hand that guides this frost now seeks the same dominion over life and time that Mortlake once imagined, and unless we act with speed and precision, we may witness the next stage of this chilling experiment." I felt a shiver despite the layers of clothing. "Holmes, what shall we do?" Holmes's gaze swept the room, the machinery, and the operator. "We intervene with care. The proof of life must be preserved. Miss Venn must not be endangered again. But the practitioner must be confronted, not merely observed. And in this confrontation, Watson, we shall see whether intellect, however brilliant, can ever outrun morality." He adjusted his gloves and respirator, his movements deliberate, precise, and full of that uncanny confidence that never failed to both alarm and reassure me. "The frost will guide us, Watson. Let us follow its footprints to their source, and at last bring this chapter of Mortlake's design to a close." Outside, the winter wind howled across the northern moors, and the first crystals of frost began to trace new patterns along the windows of the laboratory, shimmering like the first warning of a storm yet to break. Inside, Holmes's eyes gleamed with purpose, and I knew with absolute certainty that the next hours would define the final confrontation of a saga begun in ice, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge. The moment of confrontation arrived with a precision and inevitability that only Holmes could orchestrate. As we advanced through the shadows of the northern laboratory, the hiss of the frost and the rhythmic pulse of the machinery guided us like the hands of a clock, each beat marking the approach of revelation. Holmes moved silently, tracing the vapor's path with an almost preternatural awareness, noting subtle disturbances in the crystalline patterns that revealed the operator's position, even before we glimpsed him. At last, we reached the control platform. The man behind the levers, a younger, more agile figure than Mortlake, was absorbed in his work, monitoring the flow of cryogenic vapors with meticulous care. He looked up at our sudden appearance, surprise flickering in his eyes before recognition dawned. "Holmes," he said evenly, though tension creased his brow, "I wondered when you would follow the trail of frost." Holmes's gaze was unwavering. "I have pursued the same path as your mentor, and yet, unlike Mortlake, you cannot claim ignorance. Your designs endanger life, including that of Miss Venn, whose preservation you treat as a proof of genius rather than a human being. That must end tonight." The man's composure faltered for a fraction of a second, revealing the human weakness beneath his scholarly facade. "Do you understand the implications of what you claim? If I release her fully, the knowledge will advance science beyond what your narrow moral compass permits. You would stop progress for sentimentality." Holmes's reply was measured but firm. "Progress without conscience is the most dangerous frost of all. I do not oppose knowledge. I oppose the perversion of life for pride and ambition. You mimic Mortlake, but you lack the restraint that morality demands. That ends now." The younger scientist hesitated, his hands trembling as he adjusted the levers. It was then that Holmes, ever deliberate, revealed the final insight that had been forming throughout our journey. The vapor trails, the residual frost, the pattern of compound deposition, all were not merely traces of machinery, they were a fingerprint of intent. By analyzing the subtle gradients in temperature and crystallization, Holmes had determined that this operator had unknowingly left a critical flaw in the system, a point where the frost could be safely redirected, allowing the chamber to neutralize itself without harming the subject. Holmes gestured toward the chamber. "Observe, Watson. By adjusting the secondary valve, the frost will retract, dissipating harmlessly while preserving life. This is where intelligence and morality intersect, and it is the very flaw the operator could not perceive in his obsession." The younger man froze, watching as Holmes swiftly yet carefully manipulated the levers. The hiss of vapor softened, and the frost slowly retreated from the instruments and the chamber walls. The air warmed slightly, and a low hum signaled the cessation of the cryogenic cycle. Holmes motioned for me to follow. We approached the chamber. Inside, Miss Venn stirred once more, her eyes fluttering open with recognition and relief. The pale hue of frost faded, leaving her complexion natural, warm and restored. She blinked, taking in her surroundings and then meeting Holmes's steady gaze. "You saved me," she whispered. "Yes, Miss Venn," Holmes said gently, though his voice carried the authority of one who had anticipated every variable. "You are safe. No further manipulation shall touch you." The younger scientist, realizing his plans were irreversibly thwarted, sank into a chair, the weight of defeat pressing down upon him. Holmes approached and examined him carefully, noting his intellectual brilliance marred by moral blindness. "I sought to emulate genius, but genius alone does not absolve responsibility. Mortlake's methods were dangerous because he lacked restraint, and you have only continued that folly. You will answer for it, but not in the cold of ambition. Justice must temper intellect." The man nodded, silently conceding to the inevitable. The authorities, summoned discreetly by Holmes earlier, soon arrived to secure the laboratory and ensure that the dangerous materials were safely contained. The cryogenic compound was neutralized, Mortlake's designs dismantled, and the young scientist taken into custody, not merely as a criminal, but as a cautionary example of unchecked ambition. Outside, the first light of morning began to warm the frost-streaked landscape. Holmes and I escorted Miss Venn to a carriage, ensuring she would be returned safely to London under careful supervision. Her gratitude was expressed not merely in words, but in the quiet dignity of her presence, a living testament to the limits of human ingenuity when divorced from conscience. As we rode back through the awakening streets of Durham, Holmes spoke at last, his tone reflective rather than commanding. "Watson, This case has taught me that the most intricate puzzles are not merely mechanical or chemical, but ethical. Mortlake and his imitator believed intellect could transcend consequence, yet consequence remains immutable. The measure of a man is not in what he can achieve, but in what he chooses to preserve or destroy. I nodded, reflecting on the months of investigation, the frozen footprints traced across moors and laboratories, and the delicate line between genius and folly we had navigated. "And Miss Venn?" I asked. Holmes's eyes softened. "She will live, Watson, and in her survival lies the final victory. Not over frost or ambition, but over the recklessness that would have treated life as a mere experiment. In her continued existence, we see the balance restored." Back at Baker Street, we resumed our familiar routines, yet the shadow of frost lingered in our thoughts. Holmes returned to his chemical experiments, to the violin, to the puzzles that sharpened his extraordinary mind, while I recorded our experiences with the care and attention of one who has witnessed brilliance tested against peril. The city itself seemed unaware of the narrowly avoided disaster. Fog rolled in from the Thames, and the streets echoed with the distant clatter of carriages, as if life had resumed its ordinary rhythm. Yet I knew that somewhere beneath London's surface, somewhere in laboratories hidden from public view, the legacy of Mortlake's ambition might yet beckon another mind toward the perilous edge of genius. Holmes, ever vigilant, seemed aware of this possibility. One evening, as the gaslight flickered across the walls of our sitting room, he spoke softly, almost to himself. "Watson, there are footprints in the frost yet to be traced. Some trails end in revelation, others in ruin. We must be ready for both." I glanced at him, a mixture of admiration and concern in my gaze. "And you will be ready, Holmes?" He allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to cross his features. "I always am, my friend. For the frost-like ambition may return, but reason and vigilance shall remain our compass." And so concluded the extraordinary and chilling affair of the frozen footprints, a case that began with a single set of mysterious tracks and a cruel death had led us through the perilous corridors of ambition, intellect, and morality. The mystery was resolved, justice measured, and life preserved, not by the brilliance of Mortlake nor by the audacity of his imitator, but by the unerring logic, unwavering courage, and steadfast conscience of Sherlock Holmes. As the fire died down and London slumbered beyond our windows, I felt once more that awe which accompanies the witnessing of extraordinary reasoning, tempered by the knowledge that, in Holmes's hands, even the coldest footprints could be traced to their source and rendered harmless. And in that knowledge lay a quiet, profound comfort, an assurance that wherever ambition and folly walk, Holmes and reason shall follow, steadfast and unerring.